We are the greatest country in the world because we got the right to bear arms.
The American infatuation with guns has long been well documented and expounded upon. With a new shooting seemingly every year, it is an infatuation that has constantly had to be reevaluated. Despite all this, we simply cannot escape them. Quite frankly, guns are everywhere you look. But why are we so attached to the firearm? And what does that mean for the identity we present to the world?
There are an estimated 270 million guns in the hands of civilians in the United States.
270 million. A figure that exists thanks to the Second Amendment in our Constitution. And while it was only hunters and Minutemen who held guns initially, Samuel Colt sparked a revolution in the gun sales arena with the invention of the Colt 45.
We can date very precisely the point at which American homicide rates began to take off. February 25th, 1836, is when Samuel Colt patented the revolver.
Soon after the debut of the Colt 45, Civil War breaks out, after which veterans are allowed to keep their guns, putting many more weapons into circulation and ultimately changing the country forever.
That establishes a kind of base for the modern culture of personal weapons in the United States.
The year is 1871, and the NRA is established by two Civil War vets, a once moderate organization that would grow to have the largest amount of lobbying power in the U.S.
Union officers, concerned by the poor marksmanship they had witnessed in battle, formed the NRA to train young men how to shoot better.
And it's that period that sets the base for the United States, that we're a country in which self-defense weapons are widely distributed and understood to be socially necessary.
With the new national consensus on guns came the heyday of cowboy culture. It was at this time that the Colt 45, Winchester repeater, and the six-shooter made their marks on the American West. And the real-life outlaws such as Doc Holliday, Wyatt Epp, and Billy the Kid would go on to become the fodder for the mythological Wild West. But how off is the mythology from the reality?
If there's any part of American history where our relationship with guns and gun control is most misunderstood, it's the Wild West. We all have that image of the Wild West, the gunslingers roaming through town with six shooters on each hip, a Derringer pistol hidden in his leg, maybe a rifle in his hand, but nothing could be further from the truth. It turns out that the frontier towns on the Wild West had the most restrictive gun control laws in the nation.
The country as a whole wouldn't see significant nationwide regulation in gun control until the 1930s, when the seeds of organized crime, planted by Prohibition, began to bear fruit. Gangsters, such as Al Capone, had made the Thompson rifle, better known as the Tommy gun, their trademark. In response to the awesome power of these gangsters, the FBI is formed.
Once again, politicians sought to control the new wave of guns with new regulations, but this time on a national scale.
Some time ago, and I'll be glad to fire it off for you.
And that culminated in the first national legislation, the Gun Control Act of 1934, banning what they called gangster weapons.
This national legislation would mark the first governmental response to urban violence across the country. It was quickly followed by the establishment of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
But shortly after the G-men waged war in the streets, the nation was faced with war abroad, turning America's factory owners into arms dealers.
On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards. Costly to our Navy was the loss of war vessels, airplanes, and equipment, but more costly to Japan was the effectiveness of its foul attack in immediately unifying America in its determination to fight and win the war thrust upon it.
The Second World War led to unprecedented innovation and production as factories were converted to support the war effort, and weapons and ammunition were churned out around the clock. Millions of American troops quickly got accustomed to their rifles and wanted their own when the war ended.
The post-war feeling of patriotism gave way to the baby boom when troops returned home. And thanks to toys like cap guns and BB guns, children were encouraged more than ever to grab a gun and take their best shot.
Some fun when Snubby Gun plays Private Eye, and you can have the same kind of fun with Mattel's Tommy Burst Detective Set.
The Tommy Burst has automatic bolt action.
Fire off a burst of 10 shots. You're reloaded. Or fire single shots like a rifle. The Tommy burst alone is $3. In the detective set, you also get the snub-nose 38 and snap-draw shoulder holster.
In this time of inflated national ego, the idea of the morally grounded superhero would no longer cut it. Westerns and a romanticized idea of the Wild West came into prominence. The cowboy was the ideal American man who stood his ground and didn't take any guff from anyone. Perhaps the largest sign of the times was the changing of the name All-Star Comics, DC's most prized franchise in the 40s, to All-Star Western in '51. Hollywood would also see a shift in content.
At the same time, guns were also finding their way on screens large and small, in television and movies. It was the age of the Western, where guns and gunmen were often the stars.
We celebrate violence. We make heroes out of stone killers like Jesse James and Billy the Kid and Butch Cassidy and Sundance. We see them as rugged individualists who refuse to be pushed around.
The idea of a lone gunman triumphing against all the odds with nothing but good aim and a full magazine became something of a self-fulfilling prophecy cinematically. Story-based, intellectually driven mystery films were pushed out of prominence by cowboys in the 50s. This would have major implications abroad, as an entire generation of Italian filmmakers fell in love with the Western and tried their hand at it a decade later.
Tell me, why are Westerns so popular in Italy?
Westerns are popular everywhere. Some of the first films made were Westerns. In Italy, there's no doubt that it was Sergio Leone and the big success of For a Fistful of Dollars that opened the road to the Westerns made in Europe.
While the setting may have changed, The Lone Gunman was too much of a hit to disappear from American cinema, and so instead of fading into obscurity by the 70s, he was adapted with the proper psychosis to accentuate the corruption and urban decay of the time. In the 80s, he was fitted with excess and mounds of cocaine. But just as the Westerns inspired filmmakers in Italy, an unassuming audience in an island a few miles off our southeast coast was also finding inspiration. Perhaps more dangerous than the inspiration, though, were the parallels between the rough-and-tumble mythological Wild West and the very real political backdrop of Jamaica throughout the 60s into the 80s. Join me next time where we examine the impact of the cowboy on the psyche of Jamaica's political gunmen.
Stop!